proposes amendment number 40.
Mr. President, this body has spent 100.
Under the previous order, there will now be 4 minutes of debate, equally divided prior to a vote in relation to Hawley Amendment number 40.
Mr. President,
proceed.
This body has spent to date $113 billion on the war in Ukraine and counting. And yet, we do not have any direct oversight of any of the money that is being spent. My amendment is very simple. Let's create one government watchdog, not 2, not 3, not 20, one government watchdog to oversee every cent that is spent on Ukraine, to report back to this Congress and to the American people as to how their hard-earned money is being spent. Currently, there are dozens of reporting requirements. There are multiple bureaucrats who are involved. Listen, we learned this the hard way in Afghanistan, where after years of lack of oversight, billions of dollars wasted, and tragically many lives lost, this body finally created a special inspector general to oversee the Afghanistan effort and reporting requirements, to report back to the public on what we knew and were learning. That is what we should do in this case, Mr. President. I urge a yes vote on this amendment.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I don't have an objection to the notion that the funds we are spending together in Ukraine should have careful analysis. We know from past experience if there's not that careful analysis done, there can be problems. This is not the bill to do it. When we do war authorizations, we don't put other amendments on, no matter how good there be, if they're extraneous to the war authorization. The 1991 and 2002 war authorizations did not include additional items, no matter how meritorious they might have been. And so why this idea is an idea that I think people can gravitate toward. I think this is the wrong bill, the wrong vehicle to insert something about Ukraine into this repeal of the Iraq war authorizations. We've not done a repeal for 52 years. The authorizations themselves were clean authorizations, and I would urge a no vote so that the repeal, when we vote on it tomorrow, will be a clean repeal. I would urge my colleagues to vote no.
Mr. President.
The senator from Idaho.
Yeah, Mr. President, very briefly, first of all, I want to compliment Senator Hawley for pursuing this route. There isn't a person in this room, there isn't a person in America that doesn't want to see that every dollar spent by the taxpayers is looked after. In this particular instance, I'm going to oppose this simply because there are already 64 ongoing or planned audits and reports on U.S. assistance to Ukraine. This piece of legislation would require a quarterly schedule, and that actually reduces the number. For instance, USAID direct budgetary support comes every 2 months. So this is being looked after unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, where we're talking about enormous amounts of money, not that this isn't a large amount, but those were enormous, and the work in auditing was not very good. In this case, it is very good. We've been looking at it in the Intelligence Committee. We've been looking at it in the Foreign Relations Committee and have found zero siphoning of U.S. dollars. So this really is an expenditure that is not necessary because it is being looked after already. So I would urge a no vote on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, do I have any time?
The senator from Missouri. You have 49 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would just say, in response to my friend's point about there being 60-plus reporting requirements already in place, that's part of the problem. When everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge. Currently, the oversight requirements are spread across 3 different agencies, the Inspector General for the State Department and the Defense Department and USAID. Each have a little piece of this. Dozens of disparate requirements. Let's unify it. We've done this before. One Inspector General, one staff, one set of requirements. Make it public. Give the American people the accountability they deserve. I urge a yes vote. I yield for it.
Questions on the amendment? Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn. Okay. Thank you.
Without objection. Mr. President, yesterday the nation witnessed a murderous rampage at an elementary school, a small Christian school in Nashville, Tennessee. Tragically, 3 small children, 9 years old, lost their lives. 3 employees of this school lost their lives. And even as I'm on this floor now, Nashville police are releasing the body cam footage of the officers who responded with heroic speed and heroic courage to the deranged individual who made her way into that school and was executing students and teachers one by one. Those officers deserve to be praised. They deserve to be thanked. They deserve to be honored for what they did and for the lives that they saved. Mr. President, we must also tell the truth about what happened yesterday in Nashville. This murderous rampage, this taking of innocent life, was a horrific crime, but more specifically, it was a hate crime. A crime that, according to Nashville police, specifically targeted, that's their word, targeted, the members of this Christian community, the members of this religious institution, its students, its educators, its employees. Let's be clear, Mr. President, federal law prohibits the targeting of violence against any American on the basis of religious affiliation or religious practice or religious belief. But that is, according to police, exactly what we saw happen yesterday. The members of this community were singled out because of their religious affiliation, and now 3 young children are dead, and 3 educators are dead because of their affiliation with this religious institution, because of their beliefs, because of their work, because of their service. That is a crime under federal law, and it must be treated as such. Today, I have called on the director of the FBI and the Secretary of Homeland Security to open a federal investigation, a federal hate crime investigation into what happened in Nashville. We need the facts, Mr. President. We need to know about the premeditated crime. We need to know about what this shooter did and intended to do. We need to know about the influences. What kind of violent rhetoric motivated this shooter? Were there others involved? This contagion of hateful rhetoric and violence must not be allowed to spread, Mr. President, and that is why we need all federal resources, according to federal law, devoted now on the ground in Nashville to get the facts and to stop the violence from spreading further. And I call on this body, every member of this body, to condemn in the clearest of terms this hate crime against this community in Nashville. Today, I will introduce a resolution explicitly condemning this massacre as the hate crime that it is, and calling upon this body to condemn hateful rhetoric that leads to violence, hateful rhetoric against religious believers, religious institutions, religious communities that leads to violence. This isn't speculation. This is a tragic fact. It has happened before our eyes, and we must condemn it. And I would call on those corporate partners who are so quick to weigh in on social issues. Now make your voice heard. Condemn this violence as the hate crime that it is. Stand with this community in Nashville. This is a time to be heard, Mr. President. This is a time to be clear about what has happened and is unfolding before our very eyes. And let's just be crystal clear. Rhetoric about days of vengeance and genocide, rhetoric directed against religious believers of whatever background, whether they're Presbyterians, like the students and teachers and employees targeted yesterday, or some other Christian affiliation, or Orthodox Jews, or Catholics, or whatever the religious background. It is a crime under federal law to target and commit acts of violence against Americans because of their religious beliefs, because of their religious affiliation, because of their religious practices. This should not happen, Mr. President, in the United States of America. And now we must act to see that it does not spread. And so I hope the Senate will soon take up my resolution. I hope that every member of this body will be clear about what has happened in Nashville and will be clear in standing against the violence, in standing against the hate, in standing against the rhetoric, and standing with this community that needs now our support, that needs now our encouragement and condolences, yes, but also needs our action. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wisconsin.
4 months ago, the United States Senate and then the United States House came together to ban the app TikTok on all federal government devices, on tablets, on phones, on computers, on federal contractors and their devices as well. We acted just a few months ago with a sense of urgency because we decided that TikTok was a national security threat, a privacy threat, yes, a data threat, yes, but above all, a national security threat. And we were right to act just those few months ago. And now we must take the next step to ban TikTok nationwide to protect the security of every single American whose personal lives, whose personal data, whose personal security is in danger from the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. And it's time to act now because we've seen just in the last week the TikTok CEO come before the United States Congress and confirm that the reasons we acted 4 months ago were right and valid, and that the need at this hour is urgent. In this last week, we learned, we confirmed from the testimony of the TikTok CEO that TikTok has the ability to track Americans' data, to track Americans' location, to track Americans' personal lives, whether they want it to or not. What am I talking about? Well, TikTok tracks your keystrokes. Now think about that for a second. It's not just the videos you may upload if you have the app on your phone. It's not just the videos that you watch. It's the keystrokes that you enter, and not just while you are on the app. Oh no. It tracks your keystrokes all the time. What you're texting, what you're emailing. It tracks your contact list. It reads your phone list. We believe, based on independent third-party analysis, that it can get into email. And it does this whether or not the user consents. In fact, there's no way to turn it off. Americans are subject to this ongoing data collection at all hours of the day and night, even if they've got TikTok turned off on their phone. What else have we learned? Well, that TikTok is monitoring the location of Americans. It's not just your keystrokes, it's your location data. Where are you right now? What is it that you are doing? Where are you moving to? Are you in a car? Are you in a building? What floor are you on? TikTok can use the settings of your phone to track exactly where Americans are. And we know that they've been doing this. TikTok has been gathering this data, not just on American citizens, but also on American journalists. We know that they are able to see what journalists are saying, to see where journalists are going. New whistleblower revelations have showed that TikTok has spied on particular American journalists and tried to track them, tried to learn what they are writing, tried to control, in essence, or at least get an understanding of what their message might be. Think about this: an app on your phone that tracks your keystrokes, that reads your personal information, that tracks journalists around, that tracks your location. You can't do anything about it, and we haven't even gotten to the worst part. The worst part is all of this information is accessible to engineers based in China, accessible to the Chinese Communist Party. When he was asked about this last week, the CEO of TikTok didn't deny this espionage. No, what he said instead is, well, I don't think spying is the right way to describe it. Maybe he preferred the word surveillance. Maybe he preferred the word monitoring. Maybe he preferred the word tracking. But I actually think spying just about captures it. The problem with TikTok is not the videos on the app. The problem with TikTok is it's a backdoor for the Chinese Communist Party into the personal lives and information, into the most intimate details of every American's life. And we know the link between TikTok and the Chinese Communist Party is real. and we know that it is strong. TikTok is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chinese parent company, ByteDance. We know that ByteDance has Chinese Communist Party members in its senior leadership. In fact, ByteDance's editor-in-chief is a Communist Party secretary. We know the Communist Party has done trainings for TikTok and ByteDance personnel. We have video of it being done in Beijing, in China. Whistleblowers have come forward to my office and to others and given us evidence that China-based engineers are able to access Americans' personal data at any time that they want. Again, the CEO did not deny that last week. No, the links to the Chinese Communist Party are real, and they are inscribed in Chinese law. This isn't just a matter of what TikTok may want to do. No, TikTok, as a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chinese parent company, is subject to Chinese law, which both the 2014 espionage law in that country and their 2017 national security law, which require the company to turn over data that the Chinese Communist Party, that Beijing may request. Under those laws, they must make Americans' data available, must make it available to Chinese communist officials. This is in addition to the CCP members who are actually senior officials in these companies, who work in these companies, who have access to Americans' data as I stand here and speak to you today. The intent of China in all of this is quite clear. They want to build a profile on every single American. We know that many of the recent data hacks of credit agencies, of other digital repositories of Americans' personal information have been carried out by Communist China. They are hungry for information about the American people. They are gathering it on everybody that they can, as much as they can, just like they do to their own citizens. And they're using the app TikTok to do it. Of course, that's not the only way that the Chinese Communist Party has tried to gather information on Americans. This is certainly not the only time that they've done it. Think about the Confucius Institutes all across the country that the CCP funded on America's college campuses. Think about the researchers that they funded and tried to place into key programs, key institutes and universities all across the country. Heaven's sakes, think about the Chinese spy balloon that just went over this country, right over my home state of Missouri just a few weeks ago, photographing everything that they could. Now, this is a pattern. The difference is, in those cases, we addressed it. We shut down the Confucius Institutes. Those who have lied about the money that they have gotten from China, the funding that they have gotten, have in some cases been prosecuted for attempted espionage on America's college campuses. And the spy balloon was belatedly shot down, but shot down at least. No, we've taken action in these other instances to protect Americans, to stop the efforts of the CCP, to spy on America, to collect Americans' data, to put Americans at risk, and now we must do the same thing with TikTok. This is why President Trump, in the previous administration, tried to ban it. Well, let's not forget, this isn't the beginning of this debate. This is the end of it. We've been at this for years now. Years ago, the last administration tried to ban TikTok for all of these same national security reasons that led us as a Congress to ban it on federal devices. Now, this has been a long time coming. There's no rush to judgment here. This is what administration after administration has concluded, that it's time to take action. Here's the real truth, that if it were the Confucius Institutes, this Chinese spy balloon, if it were some American company that was coordinating with a foreign ally, we'd shut it down immediately. And we have done in these other cases. But with TikTok, now TikTok says, oh, no, but you can't do that to us. You can't hold us accountable. We have a special carve-out. No, we have the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects us. Well, I must have missed the class in law school where we covered the First Amendment right to spy. Last time I checked my Constitution, there was no such protection. And I can be darn sure that there is no special First Amendment carve-out for communists. No, the First Amendment may protect dance videos, sure, upload those all you want, but the First Amendment does not protect the right to spy on American citizens. It does not protect espionage. It does not protect what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do in harvesting the data of millions of Americans. Now, TikTok has no special First Amendment carve-out. They don't get special privileges that no other entity or an American company would get. They're subject to the same rules. And when you try to spy on American citizens, when you try to use Americans' own phones as portals for collection, that ought to be stopped. You ought to be banned. And the fact that they are a China-based company shouldn't help them or hurt them. The fact is their ties to Beijing, their ties to the CCP, their ongoing efforts at espionage, and their ongoing lies, by the way, to this body. This is a company that has come before this body and lied time and time again. They said that they weren't controlled by ByteDance. Now we know they are. They said that China-based engineers couldn't access American user data. Now we know they can. They said that the CCP had no influence. And yet last week, the CEO of TikTok couldn't even confirm that the CCP hadn't helped write his talking points. Now, this is an entity, this is a corporate interest that is influenced, if not controlled, by the Chinese Communist Party. The national security risks are severe and growing worse. And I haven't even talked about the materials on suicide promotion that you'll find on TikTok. I haven't talked about the risks to mental health that it may pose. And there's a reason that TikTok isn't even available in China. Did you know that? In China, TikTok isn't available. Why is that? Well, it's because Beijing isn't stupid. They know it's digital fentanyl. TikTok wasn't designed to make our lives better. TikTok is designed to addict and then to be used as a gateway into our personal lives. It's designed to addict and then to be used as a portal to spy on American citizens. Now, I tell you what, here's one thing that has changed since just December, a few months ago when we banned TikTok on federal government devices. TikTok has gone into full damage control mode. And as big tech companies do all the time, they've hired a fleet of lobbyists and have spent untold amounts of cash. I'm told that even today, TikTok lobbyists have been seen here in the building. I've no doubt that they are scurrying around right now. Maybe they're in the galleries. I just say this, that we have the opportunity today to send a message to this corporate interest that the United States Senate is not for sale, that we cannot be bought, that we cannot be purchased, we cannot be influenced by their lobbying campaign, by their corporate money, that we will instead side with the American people. We'll tell the truth about what this app is. We'll do our jobs and protect Americans. Now, some say that we ought to have a broader bill that would not actually ban TikTok, but would give new authority to the executive branch and leave it open. I don't agree with that. My view is we should act decisively to ban TikTok directly. We shouldn't give new open-ended authority to federal bureaucrats. We should target this threat specifically. That's what this bill does that we have before us today. It goes right at the problem. It bans TikTok in this country. It protects the American people, and it sends the message to Communist China that you cannot buy us. And so I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S-85 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered ready third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Madam President,
Senator from Kentucky.
reserving the right to object. There are two main reasons why we might not want to do this. The one would be the First Amendment to the Constitution. Speech is protected whether you like it or not. The second reason would be is that the Constitution actually prohibits bills of attainder. You're not allowed to have a specific bill against a person or a company. So this fails on two egregious points, pretty obvious points, and I think we ought to think about that. I think we should beware of those who peddle fear. I think we should beware of those who use fear to coax Americans to relinquish our liberties, to regulate and limit our First Amendment rights. Every accusation of data gathering that's been attributed to TikTok could also be attributed to domestic big tech companies. In fact, one of the bills they're looking at doing is broad enough that the president will be given the power to designate whatever country he sees fit to be an adversary and whatever company underneath that definition. It would basically be a limitless authority for the president to ban speech. If Republicans want to continuously lose elections for a generation, they should pass this bill to ban TikTok, a social media app used by 150 million people, primarily young Americans. This brilliant strategy comes while polls indicate that 71% of young women and men, 53% of young men voted for a Democrat candidate for Congress. Admittedly, many Democrats have joined Republicans in calling for this ban, but like most issues, the blame will stick to the Republicans more. The Republican strategy to ban TikTok comes simultaneously with GOP complaints of domestic social media companies canceling and censoring conservatives. Without a hint of irony, many of these same conservatives now rail against censorship while advocating for censorship against social media apps they worry are influenced by the Chinese. Before banning TikTok, these censors might want to discover that China already bans TikTok. Do we really want to emulate Chinese speech bans? Aren't we the ones that say it's wrong for China to ban speech, so we're going to be just like China and ban speech we're afraid of? The Vice President of FreedomWorks, John Tamney, perhaps described this situation best. Nauseating harassment of TikTok presumes Americans will be saved from Chinese authoritarianism if U.S. politicians act like Chinese authoritarians. We're going to be saved from speech if we ban it in our country. My goodness, could we think of anything more antithetical to the freedom of speech? Well, go to the app. They say, oh, the app's full of propaganda, and your young people will be dancing into communism. Well, go to the app and search for Falun Gong, the anti-communist religious sect that is persecuted in China. Go to TikTok and search for videos advocating Taiwan's independence, criticism of Chinese President Xi Jinping. Videos are all over TikTok that are critical of official Chinese positions. That's why TikTok is banned in China. Do we want to follow China's lead in banning speech? We should not let fear of communism to cause us to ignore our First Amendment protections of speech. This legislation violates not only the First Amendment of those who own TikTok, many of whom are actually Americans, not Chinese, but it also violates the First Amendment rights of the millions of young Americans who use this social media app. I ask the American people, do you want Joe Biden to be your censor? Do you want to give unlimited power to any president, regardless of party, to decide who is our adversary and which countries, and then which countries? There's not even a list of what percentage. What if the Chinese own 1% of a company or 10% of a company? One of the bills before us would allow the Department of Commerce to decide. There's 5 countries they list that are adversaries. These are big countries that have a lot of interaction with our country already. Decide which country, in addition to the 5. The Department of Commerce can designate a country as an adversary, but then they can designate a company. But there's no specific. Do the new people that are designated to be an adversary have to own 100% of the company, 50% of the company, 1% of the company? This is a crazy gift of power to one person. And I don't care which party they're in, it's a huge mistake. Doctors Muller and Farhad of Georgia Tech write, if nationalist fears about Chinese influence operations lead to a departure from American constitutional principles supporting free and open political discourse, we will have succeeded in undermining our system of government more effectively than any Chinese propaganda. Throughout the 20th century, millions of people were fed communist propaganda every day for their entire lives. And when the regimes collapsed, the people celebrated. They danced on the Berlin Wall and on the grave of communism. Have faith. Have faith that our Americans are smart enough to hear bad ideas and reject those ideas. Have faith that our desire for freedom is strong enough to survive a few dance videos. Have some faith in freedom. We don't ban things that are unpopular in the United States. Our Constitution even allows a communist party. The previous speaker said, and I quote, "There's no First Amendment carve-out for communists." Well, actually there is. In our society, you can be a communist. I don't advocate it. I think it's a terrible idea. And almost no Americans choose it, but there's a communist party here. We actually had a former CIA director who said he voted for the communist candidate in 1976. Someone I don't advise you would appoint to be the head of your CIA. But this is a free country. You can actually have terrible ideas and you can broadcast them. That's what freedom of speech is about. It's not about saying, oh, you know, I love Mother Teresa. It's not about saying things uncontroversial. It's about the ability to say things that people don't like. Have some faith in freedom. Our Constitution does protect even despicable speech, even the Communist Party. It operates today. Nobody wants to join the Communist Party, but you still can if you wish. America is a country that celebrates free expression, that cherishes free association, that is confident in the cause of liberty. If you want to address the evils of big tech, it's not the Chinese government you have to fear, but your own. In June 2021, Newsweek reported that big tech complied with 85% of government requests to hand over your personal data. So you're worried about the Chinese government? Your government has all of your data and they're sucking it up from all the big tech. So the thing is your next step to ban big tech in our country? There are some people that are promoting banning TikTok, and their next step is Facebook. This is on both sides of the aisle. This contagion is infecting the whole country, both parties. Realize that this means, with 85% of government requests to big tech being honored, this means that Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, once presented with a subpoena or a warrant, routinely hands over the documents of emails, text messages, photos, documents, calendars, contact lists, and more to your government. Big tech puts up virtually no legal fight to protect your privacy. They could go to court to stop this. Instead, there's a big cable that runs from big tech to the government, and they snoop on every bit of our information. So you want to protect privacy? Why don't we start by protecting our own privacy in this country? To those who are worried that the Chinese government might somehow now have access to millions of Americans' teenage information, realize that all social media sucks up personal data that people voluntarily provide. If you're going to ban TikTok, what's next? Arguably, several domestic apps censor conservatives more than TikTok. I know this because I've been censored and I've been banned. I've had speeches on the Senate floor that are protected by the Constitution, banned and kicked off of YouTube. I despise these people, but I'm not going to vote to ban them because I realize that intellectually, in a free country, I don't have the right to tell the New York Times to publish my op-ed or YouTube to publish my speech. I don't like what they do. Quit using them. That's what happens in a free country. You don't like TikTok? Quit using them. But don't disenfranchise 150 million Americans who are using a social media app and just say, no big deal. This is the First Amendment rights of 150 million Americans. I have a host of complaints about domestic social media platforms. They cancel conservatives, but I'm not in favor of banning one of them or regulating their speech or telling them who can post and who can't post. That's what the First Amendment's about. If you don't like TikTok or Facebook or YouTube, don't use them. But don't think that any interpretation of the Constitution gives you the right to ban them. TikTok's mission appears to be, like most other companies, to make money, and lots of it. TikTok is actually cooperating with our government. There's something called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS, and TikTok's agreed to put all of their data in Oracle's cloud, and they have agreed to work with the U.S. government. Because they so much want to make money, they will do anything to try to get rid of this accusation that they're somehow part of the Communist Party, which is not true. It's a company that's owned, probably the majority of it, by Americans and Europeans and other Asians outside of China. Less than 50% of it's owned by any Chinese. There is no Chinese government of the American TikTok. But even that being said, they're willing to put all of it under the Oracle Cloud. They're willing to have U.S. regulators be given access to this, all because they want to continue to make money. They don't want to be shut down by the censors. The First Amendment isn't necessary to protect speech that everybody accepts. The First Amendment exists to protect speech that might be unpopular or might be controversial. U.S. courts have already struck down the Trump ban on TikTok. It amazes me now that the other side that was so horrified by the idea of President Trump banning something is now jumping on board to ban it themselves. I hope saner minds will reflect on which is more dangerous, videos of teenagers dancing or the precedent of the U.S. government banning speech. For me, it's an easy answer. I will defend the Bill of Rights against all comers, even if need be from members of my own party. I object.
The objection is heard.
Madam President.
Senator from Missouri.
Would the senator from Kentucky entertain a question?
I object.
No. The objection is heard.
Madam President.
Senator from Missouri.
Madam President, I have never before heard on this floor a defense of the right to spy. I didn't realize that the First Amendment contained a right to espionage. The senator from Kentucky mentions the Bill of Rights. I must have missed the right of Chinese governments to spy on Americans in our Bill of Rights, because that's what we're talking about here. The senator from Kentucky can watch as many dance videos as he wants. I have no objection to that. Could watch them on this floor for all I care, fine. What I object to is the Communist Chinese Party using this app on Americans' phones to spy on Americans without their consent. The senator says that Americans can simply not use this app, just turn it off. That's not the case. If you turn it off, it continues to collect information. You don't get to consent. TikTok doesn't ask you, do you want to share your information? It takes it. It doesn't ask you for permission to track your location. It takes it. It doesn't ask you for permission to share it with the Communist Chinese Party. It just does it. That's the problem. Scour the Constitution, scour the First Amendment. I promise you, you won't find any right to espionage. You won't find any right to spy. And this novel right that the senator thinks he has discovered for Americans to be spied upon, I've never heard of such a thing in the history of this country. I'm astounded to learn that Americans have the right to be spied upon. So not only does China apparently get the right to spy in the First Amendment, Americans have the inalienable right to be spied upon and have all of their data taken from them. That apparently is democracy. That's not democracy. That is the abuse of our laws, the abuse of our economy, the abuse of our people by a foreign government for its purposes. So I say again, watch dance videos to your heart's content, but spy on Americans, that's where we have to draw the line. As to money, the senator said, and I think he's exactly right, that TikTok wants to make money, no doubt about it. And the money they are making, and the money that they are showering on this building, and it is having an effect. But in the end, the American people don't want to be treated as commodities to be bought and sold. Because make no mistake, it's the American people who are being bought and sold here by TikTok. They're being sold to the Chinese Communist Party for influence and money. They're being sold for the wishes and the whims of Beijing. And they're being lied to every step of the way.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, in October of this past year, the parents and students of Jana Elementary School in Florissant, Missouri, it's in the greater St. Louis area, woke to find news of an independent study that had found nuclear radioactive contamination inside the school building at Jana Elementary. Now, sadly, this probably didn't come as a total shock to those residents who've lived in Florissant and the surrounding area, because for years now, this community has had to deal with the fallout of the federal government's own nuclear program and the waste left over from it dating back to the 1940s, which was then effectively dumped in St. Louis, made its way into the water, into the soil, and now into a stream that runs right by this elementary school. So the school board wisely said we should do a study. Let's find out if it's in the school. Independent results came back and said it was in the dust on the windowsills of the school, radioactive material. The school board met, they shut down the school. Parents had kids at home for months. Then come the first of this year, the school board said we can't in good conscience reopen it. Now what's happening? School's closed. The kids are having to be bused to other locations, driven to schools outside of their neighborhood. Mr. President, this is a working class community. These are hardworking folks. They don't have the resources lying around to send their kids to other schools or to pay to move. If they did, they would. They don't. They're just trying to live their lives, work a job, get their kids a decent education, and instead they've had to deal with this. The worst part about it is the federal government refused to clean it up. When this news broke, the Army Corps of Engineers said, oh, there's nothing wrong with the school. We've tested it 1,000,000 times. It's fine. In fact, they held a press conference today in which they said the same thing. Trust us. It's fine. It's fine. I don't think any of them are sending their kids there, but trust us, they say. It's fine. When I and the school board and the parents said to the Army Corps of Engineers, you need to retest, you need to test the entire school district, then they pointed fingers and said, oh, no, it's the Department of Energy. It's their problem. So then when we went to the Department of Energy, they said, oh, no, we can't do anything. It's the Army Corps' problem. The Biden administration has spent the last 8 months now pointing fingers at each other, saying why they can't do this, they can't do that. The kids are just out of luck. I just noticed this. When that bank in California, full of billionaires who are also, not incidentally, major political contributors, when it had a problem, boy, this government moved lickety-split to bail them out. How many billions did this government spend to bail out the SVB shareholders and stakeholders and depositors? They got their bailout in no time flat. These kids, nothing. Can't even get a response. Do you know the Biden administration won't even respond to me? So, fine, we'll do it ourselves. I've introduced legislation that will order testing in the entire school district, that will mandate a cleanup of the school, and if necessary, building these kids a new school. The federal government caused this problem. The federal government should fix this problem. And just because these kids aren't billionaires or big-time political contributors or connected politically doesn't mean that they can be ignored. It doesn't mean that their lives don't matter. I just note this. Last week, the Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, when I talked to her about this bill in a public forum, I asked her in the hearing, she said that she would support the legislation. And who couldn't, Mr. President? Who couldn't support having the federal government clean up its own mess and getting some justice for these kids at Jana Elementary? And I'll just say this. This community in St. Louis has been asked to live with the fallout of the federal government's actions for decades. This is just the latest instance. For decades. The cancer rates, the rates of disease, autoimmune disorders, they're off the charts in this community. And for years, these folks have been told, just shut up and it'll be fine. Well, it's not fine. And today we're going to begin to get some justice for these kids. Today, we're going to start the cleanup process that should have happened decades ago. And so I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Environment and Public Works be discharged from further consideration of S-418 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
S-418, a bill to provide financial assistance to schools impacted by radioactive contaminants and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I know of no further debate on the bill.
Is there further debate? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Bill is passed.
I ask unanimous consent that the motion to reconsider be considered laid and made upon the table.
Without objection.
I yield the floor. Madam President.
Senator from Missouri is recognized.
Madam President, in the last 20 years in the state of Missouri, I call up my amendment, number 93, and I ask that it be reported by number. Start with that.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Missouri, Mr. Hawley, proposes an amendment numbered 93.
Madam President, in the last 20 years in the state of Missouri, we have lost 60,000 jobs to the People's Republic of China. That number nationwide is almost 4 million. Our trade deficit with China, as we stand here tonight, is at near record levels, and every dollar of that deficit represents blue-collar jobs destroyed, industry shuttered, manufacturing capacity withering away. I'd submit to you that it is the most important deficit that we face. And we can talk about budget reforms and we can talk about savings here and there, but until we do the work of bringing back productive capacity to this nation and good-paying blue-collar jobs you can raise a family on, we will not put our economy on the basis that we need to address the economic challenges that we face. So my amendment does something very simple. It imposes across-the-board tariffs on China for every year in which we have a trade deficit until that deficit is zero. Bring back jobs to this country.
Senator's time has
yes
expired. Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, I rise in opposition to the amendment. As my colleagues know, I take a back seat to no one when it comes to standing up to China. Lindsey Graham and I have been fighting to close the trade deficit for decades. I went to junior high at Johnny Appleseed Junior High in Mansfield, Ohio, with the sons and daughters of machinists and IUE members and steel workers and auto workers and carpenters and millwrights and plumbers and pipe fitters and operating engineers. By the time I was 10 years later, most of these jobs were gone, and so much of industrial America all over the country has been lost because of bad trade policy with China. But you know, Madam President, the People's Republic of China would love for us to pass this amendment, because if it passes, the United States of America will default. They will be rejoicing in Beijing. Stand up to China, vote no on this amendment.
Senator from Missouri.
Madam President, I ask the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, today there are new revelations, new evidence about the extent of the radioactive contamination that has plagued the St. Louis area since the 1940s. Where did this radioactive contamination come from? Simple. It came from the federal government. Beginning in the 1940s in the Manhattan Project, St. Louis was a center of development for uranium. But what did the federal government do when the Manhattan Project concluded? Well, we know more today after 15,000 pages of documents that had previously not been released were obtained by a parents' rights group in St. Louis and shared with news organizations. Here's what we learned: that the federal government gave this radioactive waste, fobbed it off onto companies in the region who did what? Who poisoned the water, who poisoned the soil, who poisoned the air, and the government knew about it. Oh yeah, they knew about it. They knew about it for decades, and for year upon year upon year, they played down the threats. They tried to hide the evidence. They told the people of St. Louis, oh, everything's fine. No, don't be worried. Don't worry at all. It's all fine. And meanwhile, kids playing along a creek filled with radioactive waste, kids going to school in buildings contaminated by the waste, residents coming out to houses, building homes in areas contaminated. And then the government wonders why the levels of cancer and autoimmune diseases and rare genetic disorders have spiked in the St. Louis region. Oh, we know. We know. It's because of the radioactive material from the federal government dumped into the St. Louis water and air and soil. Let's just review what we have learned. We now know that as early as 1949, that's right, 1949, the federal government paid a contractor, private contractor, to dispose of waste, but instead that contractor left the radioactive waste in steel drums sitting out in the open, in the elements, right next to a creek called Coldwater Creek, familiar to just about everybody who lives in the St. Louis region. It's familiar because whole housing developments and neighborhoods and, yeah, schools have been built along Coldwater Creek. Well, as early as the 1940s, that radioactive waste began to leach out of those steel drums into the water, and it gets worse. The same federal government paid another contractor to dispose of other waste, and what did they do? Rather than dispose of it, they drove it to a public landfill. And in the early 1970s, they just dumped the waste right into the landfill. Dumped it right into the landfill. How did this happen, you might ask? Well, as it turns out, that is a violation of federal law, you think? But what did the federal government do about it in the 1970s when they learned that this government-paid contractor had carried out this illegal act? Did they prosecute him? Did they fine him? Did they at least have a hearing and ask some questions? No, no, and no. They did nothing. And so the waste seeped into the soil, spread into the soil, and all the time the people of St. Louis were told, don't worry, it's all going to be fine. A 1976 government test revealed that the levels of radiation in the creek water were at extremely dangerous levels. 1976. And here we sit in 2023, and we are told by this same federal government, the EPA, the Department of Energy, the Army Corps, that the cleanup of Coldwater Creek won't be done until at least 2038. Earlier this year, the school alongside Coldwater Creek, an elementary school, had to close, apparently permanently, because of radioactive contamination found inside the school. Now, in response to that, this body took action and passed my bill to mandate federal cleanup of the school, and if that can't be cleaned up, a new school to be built. And I thank my colleagues for their unanimous support for that activity. But that's not going to be enough. No, it is clear today that further action is needed because the federal government has caused this harm. I want to be crystal clear about this. This is not the people of St. Louis saying that we had a weather incident, which would be bad enough. It's not a natural disaster, which would be terrible. No, no, no. This is their government using them essentially as human guinea pigs. This is their government dumping radioactive material into their water, into their soil, and then lying to them about it. Not even for a year or 2 years, but for 3/4 of a century. And it still continues today. As I stand here, the Army Corps of Engineers insists there needs to be no further testing, either around the elementary school, which is now closed, or anywhere else in the St. Louis region. And at the same time, the EPA is admitting that the radioactive contamination of the soil has spread further than they previously admitted. I mean, what is it going to take to get some basic justice for the people of St. Louis? We're talking, Madam President, about working people. These are people who moved to these regions of the city in search of a quiet neighborhood, a good school for their kids, an opportunity at a better future. These are parents who allowed their kids to play in the creek because wasn't it awesome to have a creek right by their neighborhood? These are parents who sent their kids to the school trusting that they'd get a great education. And what did they get instead? Exposure to radioactive contamination. This shouldn't happen in this country. And when it does happen, the federal government should make it right. That's what needs to happen now, Madam President. I am sick to death of hearing the excuses from this government for decades on end. I am sick of the lies that they have told to the people of St. Louis, to working people from neighborhoods all across the city, that everything is just going to be fine. Just trust us. It's all going to work out. And I'm tired of this administration, which has still refused to answer my repeated pleas, to mount a cleanup effort at Jana Elementary School to clean up Coldwater Creek. All we get is finger pointing and blame shifting. The Department of Energy says it's the Army Corps' fault. The Army Corps says it's the Department of Energy's fault. Heck, for the recent news reports, the Department of Energy wouldn't even comment. They referred the reporters to the Department of Justice. I mean, what next? Here's what needs to happen next. It is time for this body to act. In the past, when we have asked members, citizens, members of this nation, when we've asked them to bear unique burdens, When we have put them in harm's way, we have said, if you will serve your country in this way, we will stand with you. That's essentially what the people of St. Louis have been asked to do. The Manhattan Project, which was a national project for war, the people of St. Louis have borne the burden of it. And now it's time for their government to make it right. What needs to happen is this. The federal government needs to pay the medical bills for any St. Louis resident who has contracted cancer or an autoimmune virus or a genetic disorder because of exposure to radioactive contamination. The federal government needs to act. And so I will introduce legislation that will create a fund to make the people of St. Louis whole. Sadly, for some it's too late. This has been going on for decades, and too many members of our community have already been lost to cancer, to disease, to the hazards that were imposed on them by their government without their knowledge and without their consent. But that is no reason not to act now. We should act and act swiftly to provide remediation, to provide support for every member of this community who has suffered because of the actions of the federal government. We've done it in the past. We've done it for our veterans. We've done it for other folks who have been negatively impacted by the nuclear program dating back to the 1940s, and we should do it now in the city and region of St. Louis. I will introduce legislation that will provide this support, that will provide this justice to the people of St. Louis. And I'll just close by saying this. It is justice that we are talking about. This is not a handout to the people of St. Louis. They're not asking for a giveaway. They're asking for some basic fairness. When their government imposes on them disease and disaster because of nuclear contamination, the least their government can do is to make it right. And I will come to this floor as long as it takes until we make it right for the men and women and children of St. Louis. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Mr. President.
The chair recognizes the senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I'd like to call up my amendment number 1058 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Missouri, Mr. Hawley, proposes an amendment number 1058.
Mr. President, I ask for 6 minutes of debate prior to the roll call vote.
Without objection.
Mr. President, for 50 years, the federal government has put into the water, into the soil, into the air of St. Louis and surrounding regions radioactive nuclear material. They have not told the people of St. Louis. They have not compensated the people of St. Louis. They have not helped the people of St. Louis. In fact, just the opposite. For decades, they told the people of St. Louis, no problem. There's no problem here. Meanwhile, children were dying of cancer. People all over the region contracting autoimmune diseases. Why? Because the groundwater has been poisoned, because the creeks where they played in have been poisoned. And now we know for a fact the government has covered it up for decades. Mr. President, it is time to make this right. The amendment we are about to vote on is a very simple amendment. It is about basic justice, compensating the victims of the federal government's negligence for what the government itself has done. And it hasn't only happened in Missouri. It's happened around the country, which is why this amendment would reauthorize a victims fund for those who have suffered because of the government's negligence. And by suffered, I mean gotten sick and had family members die. In Missouri, in states across the country, it reauthorizes it, and it makes it available to those who have been the victims of what the government has done. This is a bipartisan bill. I am proud to have worked with Senator Lujan, Senator Crapo, Senator Schmidt, and others. And now I'd like to recognize the senator from New Mexico, Senator Lujan.
Mr. President.
So, oh my God, the distinguished gentleman from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I want to commend Mr. Hawley and Mr. Crapel for the work they've done here, and all of our colleagues and staff that have contributed to telling this story, and the support that I expect to see today, and that I hope we will get this across the finish line. Almost 80 years ago, New Mexico became ground zero for the detonation of the first nuclear bomb. Millions of people across the country traveled to theaters this weekend, and they saw a blockbuster centered around this infamous day. But not enough people have focused on the collateral damage caused by our nation's nuclear weapons testing. People that sacrificed on behalf of our country for national security purposes, working day in and day out in states like Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Missouri, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nevada, Texas, Oregon, North Dakota, Idaho, Utah, Montana, and others. They deserve our support. Folks have traveled to Washington with lung cancer, oral cancer, asthma, heart problems, begging us to extend and expand the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. A few years ago, an elder from the Navajo Nation traveled here to testify, and she looked us all in the eye, and she asked a simple question. Are you waiting for us all to die for the problem to go away? I asked this body to show these victims compassion, understand their pain and suffering, so that they know it's not gone unnoticed. I respectfully ask for your vote. I yield back.
Mr. President.
The senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. When America conducted nuclear tests in Nevada, New Mexico, and the Pacific, we had little understanding of how radiation spread. Throughout my time in Congress, I've advocated for expanding the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to cover the forgotten victims of these tests, including the residents of all the affected states that have been identified here today. Downwinders, those affected by these tests, deserve to be compensated for the effects of these weapons. I'm grateful for working with Senator Lujan and Senator Hawley and our other colleagues to ensure that we do not leave our downwinders behind.
Mr. President.
The chair, the senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of this amendment, and I'm proud to work on it with my colleague from Missouri and others in a bipartisan way to provide some relief for the people who have been affected by this. And here in Missouri, I can tell you, a couple of weeks ago, I gave my maiden speech, and I talked a lot about where I grew up. And I grew up in a blue-collar town in the shadow of the airport in Bridgeton. And that is the epicenter of where this happened, near the airport, near a landfill, in those areas in the city and in North County. People work hard. They always have. And little did they know that this hazardous toxic waste was being dumped in their water, on the ground, where their children play. And all this amendment does is reauthorize something that's been on the books for decades and allows people who have been affected to apply. So I'm proud to support the people who've been affected who are looking for some measure of justice. Nothing will make them whole, but this is a step. And I'm proud to work with my colleagues in that regard, too. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back.
Mr. President, I will request the ayes and nays.
Objection. Mr. President, on October the 7th, 2023, the terrorist organization Hamas invaded the state of Israel. Terrorists killed 1,400 Israeli civilians, including women and children, people asleep in their beds. They went door to door, shot Israelis in their homes, shot soldiers as they were asleep, unawares in their barracks. They wounded more than 3,700 civilians. That includes 31 Americans at least. Over a dozen Americans have been taken hostage, and many, many more Israelis. It's the worst attack on the Jewish people and the state of Israel in 50 years. It is truly an existential threat to the state of Israel and really to the safety of Jewish Americans and Jewish people all across the world. Mr. President, perhaps incredibly disturbing, maybe almost as disturbing as the facts of these terrible attacks themselves is the response of some people in this country, on our college campuses in this country, who promptly took to the streets, to the courtyards of these campuses, to the airwaves, to broadcast their support for this genocide against the people of Israel. That's right, I said their support for the genocide against the people of Israel. Listen to what these students said at Harvard University. Students wrote that, and I quote, "They hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence." Think about that. They hold the Israelis, the Jewish people, responsible for their own death and massacres. They hold the Jewish people responsible for their babies' heads being chopped off. They hold the Jewish people responsible for the homicidal maniacs who came to their doors and gunned them down in cold blood. They hold them responsible. Students at New York University School of Law wrote that they believe Israel bears full responsibility for this tremendous loss of life. Full responsibility. Students at Ohio State praised the heroic resistance in Gaza. Heroic. It's now heroic to massacre Jews in cold blood. It's now heroic to try and carry out a genocide against Jewish people. Students at the University of North Carolina said, "It is our moral obligation to be in solidarity, no matter the pathway to liberation," their word, "that they choose. This includes violence." This includes violence. This is an out-and-out endorsement by American students for violence against Jewish people and the state of Israel. You know, it's not just Jews in Israel who are threatened by these outrageous remarks. Jewish Americans on our campuses have been threatened. Columbia University had to close their campus temporarily when an Israeli student was physically assaulted and Jewish American students threatened. Jewish American students have been threatened across the country in all sorts of settings, not least on our college campuses. And in the wake of this, campus leaders have been silent. They have refused to condemn this violent, virulent, genocidal, anti-Semitic rhetoric for what it is. Now, I want to be clear, Mr. President. I believe in our Constitution. The Constitution is the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects the right to free speech. And as I've said on this floor before, the First Amendment is the right to be wrong. So, these students can say this kind of virulent, moral idiocy if they want, so long as they don't themselves encourage violence. Although I just say, when you say that this includes violence, that there ought to be violence, they're coming pretty darn close. Pretty darn close. But let's just assume that their remarks are protected speech. That doesn't mean we have to endorse them. That doesn't mean we have to say, oh, yeah, it's fine, it's just another opinion. No, it's not just another opinion. Calling for the death of Jewish people is not just another opinion. Calling for the genocide, celebrating the genocide of Jewish babies is not just another opinion. Celebrating the assaults on Jewish people in this country is not just another opinion. And the Senate should be clear and stand with moral clarity and say, this is wrong. Can you say it in this country? I guess you can, but it's wrong. And frankly, it shouldn't be hard. It shouldn't be hard to say we condemn this rhetoric, we recognize the right of Israel to exist, talk about basic principles here, and we recognize the right of Israel to defend itself. Things, by the way, that the president has said. Shouldn't be hard for this body to say it, but it is vital, morally necessary in this moment of attack, in this moment, frankly, of danger for Jewish people in Israel, around the world, and sadly on our college campuses. And so that's why, Mr. President, I've offered this resolution, along with my co-sponsors, that condemns the terrorist attacks by Hamas, that denounces this violent rhetoric here in the United States against Jewish people, Jewish Americans, and of course the state of Israel, and recognizes the right of Israel to defend itself. It's a pretty simple amendment. And I can't imagine, Mr. President, what the objection to it would be. So I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 418, which is at the desk. I further ask that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
The senator from Missouri is absolutely right.
about the horror of the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel. I was at the Kfar Aza kibbutz at the end of June. That was the site of one of the massacres. 50 people gunned down, killed. Dads, moms, kids. We have to condemn the horror of the Hamas attack in the strongest terms. And we will, as a body, make sure that we stand by our ally and partner, Israel, as it prosecutes its fight against Hamas. Not only does Israel have the right to defend itself, it has an obligation and duty to its people to defend itself. And I am confident that in the coming days, the United States Senate will provide more than just words of support. Those are very important, and I want to applaud the President of the United States for what he's been doing, but also tangible support. This resolution is not about condemning Hamas's attacks on Israel. What this resolution does is condemn certain speech around the country. Now, let me just say to my colleague from Missouri, I stand with anybody and second to none when it comes to condemning anti-Semitism, whether in words or in actions. And I have stood up throughout my time in public service to do exactly that. And if the senator from Missouri wants to bring to the floor of the Senate a resolution condemning anti-Semitism, a resolution that points out what we just saw from the most recent FBI statistics about the rise in anti-Semitism, I will join with him in that effort. But what this resolution does is attempt to smear students, many of whom engaged in anti-Semitic remarks, but many who did not. And my view is that when you come to the Senate floor to pass such a resolution and you're talking about freedom of speech, it's very important not to paint a broad brush and condemn everybody engaging in speech. This is what this resolution does. It's an attempt to say, even to those who had legitimate statements to make about war and peace, to smear them all as making anti-Semitic remarks. I would also say to my colleague that there have been a lot of other anti-Semitic remarks around the country, from radio show hosts to others. And if we want to make it a practice of regularly coming to condemn remarks, hateful remarks, whether anti-Semitic or racist or anti-gay or whatever it may be, then the United States Senate's going to have to think long and hard about doing exactly that. I heard you mention violence. Most of these protests, as repugnant as some of them were in terms of the words, were not violent. The one terrible violent hate crime we have seen in the United States since this Hamas's awful attacks was a 6-year-old Palestinian-American Muslim boy in Chicago, stabbed 27 times. You mentioned here, whereas Columbia University was forced to close its campus to the public after an Israeli student was violently assaulted. I ask whether my colleague from Missouri wants to also include in a resolution violent acts that were hate crimes. The police have said these are hate crimes. He was attacked because he was a Muslim. I don't see any condemnation of that in this resolution. Nothing. So I would stand with my colleagues in standing up to hateful rhetoric, condemning anti-Semitism, but what this resolution does is not that. I'd be happy to yield.
What of the rhetoric that is cited specifically in the resolution? You talked about legitimate concerns. What specifically do you think is legitimate?
I'm not suggesting to my colleague that any particular statement that he took out from these protests was a legitimate statement. No. But what you are doing here is smearing all of the students who engage in these protests. Yes, you are. And that is wrong. And I would just invite you, again, to join with me if we're going to get in this practice, and I don't suggest it, this is one of the reasons I'm here, of when there are terrible, hateful remarks made against any group, whether they be blacks or other minority groups, the United States Senate,
Senator,
maybe we'll weigh in, but in
you
this
said we're
issue,
smearing student groups. What's the smear? Point me to the
on
language.
this issue, there are student groups that may have legitimate concerns, for example, about, just a minute, legitimate concerns about the loss of innocent civilian life in Gaza.
This resolution.
No. But what you are doing is saying you're questioning based on certain remarks made by some students.
Senator,
you're questioning them all.
We are condemning.
I object.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
And Mr. President, if I may,
Mr. President,
I have to. I had to run down to the floor. I've got another
floor.
meeting, but I object.
It's hard to believe that we've just heard on this floor defense of the most vile anti-Semitic rhetoric under the excuse that to call out specifically the specific statements and denounce them one at a time and say this is wrong, that is somehow a smear. What that is a failure of moral nerve. What it is a failure of moral clarity. What it is frankly sympathizing with this rhetoric. I don't know why it's so hard, but I guess we've now found out why college presidents won't come out and say, this is wrong. We cite the specific words. Why is it wrong to say that it includes violence? Why is it wrong to condemn this? When students say the heroic resistance in Gaza should be praised, they're not referring to something in general. They're talking about the attack on Israel, the slaughter of innocent Israelis, and that's perfectly fine. Those are legitimate concerns. This is the moral equivalency, Mr. President, that has seeped into our college campuses and I guess to the floor of the United States Senate is unbelievable. But let there be no mistake. What's happened today is one senator has blocked this body from condemning the attacks against Jewish people in Israel, Jewish Americans in this nation, and pretended that there's some moral equivalency here between this and what? The state of Israel is under existential threat. We have students in this country who are specifically calling for and celebrating the killing of Jews, and we can't condemn that on the floor of the Senate? To say I'm disappointed is an understatement, Mr. President, but I will say this, it is a revealing moment. I yield for it. Mr. President, 1 week ago, I came to this floor to try and pass this very resolution that condemns the violent, genocidal, anti-Semitic rhetoric and actions on our college campuses all across this country. Sadly, I was blocked by one of my Democrat colleagues, and since then, the situation at our universities has only worsened. I offer you just two examples. I could multiply these examples, sadly, but let's just take two. On Tuesday of this week, just 2 or 3 miles from where we stand now on the floor of the United States Senate at the George Washington University, pro-Hamas students projected onto the side of the university library various anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, pro-genocide slogans, including "Glory to our martyrs," in reference to the terrorists who attacked the state of Israel, not just the state of Israel, but who committed cold-blooded murder of babies, cutting off their heads, shooting women and children in their homes, executing soldiers as they lay sleeping in their barracks. These same students projected other slogans onto the library wall. Free Palestine from the river to the sea. What's that mean? Well, it is a reference to Hamas's long-standing call for the extermination of the state of Israel. Let's just be clear. This is a reference to their call for genocide of Jews in the Middle East and everywhere they can get their hands on them. This is what is going on our college campuses, and if you talk to the students who were there at George Washington University that night, what they will tell you is they feared for their safety, they feared for their lives, they don't know if they're any longer welcome on campus or physically safe on campus. And what did the university do in the wake of this attack? Well, the answer has become all too familiar. Virtually nothing. They issued a statement saying that students weren't authorized to project these genocidal slogans onto the library wall, and that's about it. Mr. President, we have to do a heck of a lot better than that. Last night, at Cooper Union, an institution of higher education in the state of New York, Jewish students were barricaded inside their own library as a pro-Hamas group rampaged through the building, shouting violent slurs at these students, and then pounded on the library doors seeking to gain entrance. This morning's New York Post reads, Cooper Union barricades Jewish students inside library as pro-Palestinian protesters bang on the doors. The students who were there last night spoke of being herded into the library, of campus security saying they didn't think they could protect them. Campus security then locking the doors to the library to try and keep the Jewish students inside, and an angry mob assembling. There are photos of this. Don't take my word for it. The video is available everywhere. Go look for yourself. An angry mob of pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas students banging on the windows, the glass windows of the library, at the Jewish students who are literally barricaded inside. These students were calling 911, calling their relatives, asking for help. Eventually, an hour or more later, campus security reportedly took them out through the back door, Mr. President. They couldn't walk out the front door of a library in their own school. They had to be taken out the back for fear, I guess, of their safety, perhaps also for appearances. I can't help but think, Mr. President, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, the President of the United States had to activate the 101st Airborne Division to make sure African American students could go to class in this country without being physically assaulted. Is that what it's come to now on America's college campuses? Are we going to have to activate the National Guard to see that Jewish students can go to class in safety without being in fear of their lives? I would just say this, Mr. President. As a nation, we must speak with one voice and say that there is a right and there is a wrong, there is good and there is evil, and threatening to kill an entire class of people is wrong and it is evil. Speaking up, shouting in support of genocide is wrong and it is evil. Threatening the lives of your fellow students because they are Jewish is wrong and it is evil. Plainly, these institutions of so-called higher learning have failed these students. I mean, these students have clearly no idea what right and wrong means. You project stuff like this on a library wall while your Jewish classmates stand on in fear for their lives. You don't have any idea about what right and wrong is. Clearly, these institutions have failed these students, which is why we need to speak with moral clarity now. This is a teachable moment, Mr. President. This is a moment for us to say that genocide is wrong, that terrorist attacks against Jews are wrong, that threats on the lives of Jewish people anywhere, the Middle East, in this country, Europe, anywhere, is wrong. This shouldn't be hard. But we have to do it, Mr. President, so that these students and everywhere within sound of our voice can understand what right and wrong means, can understand the moral gravity of the situation we are now confronting. That's why what we are doing today matters, and that's why I'm pleased today that we are able now finally to pass this resolution that explicitly names the rhetoric, explicitly calls out the language of pro-violence, pro-genocide, and says that is wrong. Now, I want to be clear, Mr. President, our First Amendment, of which I am a great defender, our First Amendment allows people to say the most terrible things, vile, horrible, reprehensible things. The First Amendment, as I've often said, is the right to be wrong, and these students are absolutely wrong. So they may have the right to say these things, although I just add, nobody has the right to threaten violence against other Americans or anybody within their ambit. They may have the right to say terrible things, to say that they're in favor of genocide, to say that they want to see Jewish people killed. They may have the right to say those things, but that doesn't mean we have to agree with it. That doesn't mean that we have to say, oh, it's morally neutral. Sure, you can say it, fine. We have no opinion. No, no, no. The answer to that kind of hateful, virulent, dangerous speech is speech with moral purpose. It is language with moral clarity. It is a moral stand that says, no, that is wrong. That's not us. That is not the United States of America. And that, Mr. President, is what we're doing right here, right now, on this floor today. I yield the floor.
1200 to Amendment number 1092.
Mr. President.
Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes for debate equally divided. Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, the appropriations bills that we are now considering appropriate a total of $280 billion, $280 billion in taxpayer money, money that will be used by agencies ranging from the Department of Veterans Affairs to Transportation and Agriculture. And this amendment does something very simple. Whatever other disagreements we may have about the spending in these bills, surely we can agree that this money ought to go to Americans and American companies and our allies. So all this amendment does is it says that none of the money we are appropriating can go to China. It can't go to Chinese companies or companies that are owned and controlled by China. That's it. It's simple. No American taxpayer dollars to the People's Republic of China. This should be an easy vote, Mr. President. I urge a yes vote.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I want to make clear, I also worry about the influence of Chinese entities, but this amendment is not the answer. This amendment could have far-reaching, unintended consequences that would affect our agency's ability to fulfill their missions and serve people. If this amendment passed, VA could face challenges in obtaining products for essential mission needs like pharmaceuticals or medical devices and IT. This amendment could negatively impact procurement of meat for the school meals program. For example, Smithfield is owned by a Chinese company. This amendment would actually prohibit USDA from purchasing hogs from any U.S.-based farmers owned by Smithfield. Is that what we want? It could also prevent Americans from understanding the security challenges related to Chinese-made drones, because this amendment would mean the FAA would no longer be able to purchase drones made by Chinese entities to conduct critical counter-UAS research, testing analysis, or training. Mr. President, we should have more time to carefully consider the impact of this amendment and the serious unintended consequences it could have before adding it to this legislation. I urge a no vote.
President.
Senator from Missouri.
Do I have any time remaining, Mr. President?
15 seconds, sir.
I would just say, Mr. President, do we want to be buying school lunches from China? Do we want to be buying pharmaceuticals from China and be dependent on them?